Thank you, everybody, so much for coming in tonight, for taking the time, doing the work to come in to tonight's session. For some of you, for coming in after work. See how I'm working that in? For tonight's topic, which is the question in this 8th of 10-week sessions, what is work? That most human of questions on a planet in which most species struggle with the simple question of survival and getting to tomorrow, this most human of questions we have about what it is we will be doing, and what for so many of us helps define who we are and not only what we do. You students are already rehearsing this question in probably the most personal and individual of ways, thinking about, for example, what it is you feel like you should be studying in anticipation of figuring out the kind of work you want to do. That's one of the unique parts of this week's question. Not only the very individual ways in which each of us struggle to answer it on our own terms and in ways that open doors to possibilities not present in other parts of our life, but also, of course, for the ways in which our answer to that helps negotiate that most complex of contemporary boundaries between what we think of as work and everything else in our lives, at a time in which work, in fact, has the capacity to almost completely overwhelm every other dimension of our being. One of the interesting things about work is that it's something, it's an idea, it's a reality that makes us think about its opposite. For many people, asking a question about work poses the immediate opposite question about what might be leisure, what might be play. And in fact, that's one of the really interesting features of this week's question compared to many others that we've looked at in the course. Many years ago, at a design workshop I was running, one of my own students posed this kind of opposite quality in a really beautiful way. We were in Hong Kong in August in 1997. It was so hot you could hardly get across the street to get to work in the studio where we were all supposed to be working all week. After 2 or 3 days as visitors, we as teachers came up with the idea of simply shifting the teaching time to the coolest part of the day in Hong Kong that let us get to the studio without too much of a task. We moved the hours of teaching from 2 to 7 a.m. After the night markets had closed, and it got marginally cooler, which had the terrific effect of helping us get a lot more work done than we had in the first few days, but also the unexpected consequence of making everybody extremely jet-lagged for the full 2 weeks. At the end of the session, we asked for feedback from the students like we always do. One of my students shot his hand up immediately and said, "I signed up for a workshop. This is all work and no shopping." And in a funny way, he kind of summarized perfectly the fact that whenever it is we think about work, we are inevitably put in a position, for those of us absolutely fortunate enough to even pose the question, which so many in our world are unable to do when they're simply looking for the possibility of work, for the means it provides for their daily survival. But for those of us lucky enough to pose the question, almost always what it puts on this table is the question of what else other than work fills our lives. And so to help us with the work we're going to do tonight on the question of what work is, let me invite our guests out for this evening. Henri Lucas, Kathy Opie, Abel Valenzuela, and Al Osborne. Come on out, you guys. Thank you, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. Let me just briefly introduce each of our guests as they get used to the bright lights here on the stage. I know, I'm sorry. This is first, beginning over on the far side, design media arts professor Willem Henri Lucas. I think that was a woo. Okay. Henri is a designer whose work is based predominantly in the fields of art and culture. Primarily a book designer, Most of Henri's projects are self-initiated, and he often serves as both editor and designer of those projects. He is interested in addressing social issues and encourages future designers to be a valuable part of their many different communities they live in throughout their life. Next to Henri, art professor Kathy Opie. More woos. More woos is a Los Angeles-based artist whose photographs include series of portraits and American urban landscapes, ranging in format from large-scale color works to smaller black and white, moving from the territory of the body to the framework of the city. Kathy's many and varied photographic series are linked together by a conceptual framework of cultural portraiture. Abel Valenzuela is Chicano Studies and Urban Planning professor here at UCLA and is director of UCLA's Institute for Research on Labor and Employment. Abel has authored numerous research articles, books, and reports on immigrant settlement, work, and urban poverty. His research on day labor and immigrant labor markets has helped frame national public and policy narratives on immigration and low-wage workers. And finally, global economics management and entrepreneurship professor Al Osborne, Jr., is interim dean of UCLA's Anderson School of Management, next door here to Kaufman Hall, and the founder and faculty director of the Harold and Pauline Price Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. His research and teaching promotes moral, value-based leadership with an active practice of achieving desired outcomes in constructive and collaborative ways. Everybody, our guests for this evening's conversation. Thank you all so much for taking the time and coming in. Thank you. And as is our format every week, we are going to begin with a series of presentations, one by each of our guests this evening, and we're going to start with Henri Lucas.
Thank you. So for over 30 years, I have two types of work. One is being an educator, which I really love, and which gives me an income. And it also supports the other part of work I do, which is being a designer, which actually costs me money because I don't work for clients anymore, and I initiate my own projects. So for this discussion, I will talk about the role of work in my life, inseparable from identity and sense of purpose, and its disconnection in large part from normative understandings of work. Design became my way to express myself, to document who I am as a person and what I love and live for. I see my body of work as a self-portrait, and in many ways it's a better representation of who I am, definitely preferred over speaking, like I do now, or writing. I am a maker. It's the only thing I want to do in life, and my work is driven by my curiosity, my own personal beliefs, and the never-ending quest in becoming a better human being. I come from a family of immigrants. In 1962, the year I was born, Papua New Guinea was no longer Dutch territory, which meant for my dad, Dutch Indonesian, and my mom, Indonesian Chinese, that they had to leave the village, the Dutch village that they grew up in, and move back or move to the Netherlands. I'm explaining why they didn't move back, because both of them never lived in the Netherlands. So my dad worked as an architect, and she ran a successful restaurant. They had 6 kids at the time, and I was just a 1-month-old baby. Even though my father had never lived in the Netherlands, he grew up and was raised Dutch and self-identified as Dutch. He sent his children to Dutch schools and made sure they never spoke any native language. So he had great expectations, and he was a huge dreamer. Ending up in the Netherlands was a huge disappointment, though. Like all immigrants that we see now all over the world, the circumstances in which they were brought in were not very great. And so it took them 2 years to get housing in a very small farmers' village in the east of the Netherlands. My father became a factory worker, and my mom had to take on several cleaning jobs and later catering jobs to make ends meet, to provide for 7 kids by then. So work for my parents suddenly had turned into survival. And I bring this up because it actually explains how I look at work. So 2 things my dad found extremely important for his kids. One, they would have to become more Dutch than even possible. They have to beat the Dutch at anything, learning, sports, what have you, and basically turn us into super Dutch citizens. But by doing so, also denying us everything that had to do with our Asian culture and background. In my relationship to my parents, that caused for a huge cultural gap next to the generational gap. Number 2, our future professions should be the one that he found honorable, and guess what was on top of his list? Teacher. So he succeeded with his 3 oldest kids. They became elementary teachers, and then that dream started to fall apart because the younger kids didn't listen to Dad anymore. So I grew up in that tiny village. I spoke very late as a child. As a toddler, I would just point to things and then later relied on drawings to communicate. I also found growing up in a household with 6 other kids extremely loud. And somehow I escaped to books to get my calm and quiet and was also extremely shy. School was easy for me. I got okay grades with little to no effort. And the only interest I really had was in my drawing and my crafts classes. And my drawing teacher told me to apply for art school. This was something I didn't tell my parents because I knew they would not approve of that. So I just turned 17 and I started art school in Arnhem at the graphic design department. And art and design literally gave me a voice. And so the 5 years in art school are amongst the most important years in my life. Even though trained to be a chameleon and to adjust and adapt to every client with its own wishes and wants and needs, I learned that if I had no connection to the subject matter or the topic at hand or the client, I would get extremely unhappy and always thought this was a huge character flaw. I wanted to make work that mattered to me and that created a body of work that talked to each other and that related to each other. And I wanted a practice that was maybe more applicable to an artist than a designer. So after graduation, I started as a freelance designer. And most of my work had to do with young, beginning theater makers, musicians, dancers and choreographers, and then slowly activist work seeped in because I was working for the biggest gay organization in the Netherlands and designed most of the health information for HIV and AIDS in the Netherlands. Then at 25, I was asked to teach at the academy in Utrecht, which made my mom so proud, and she was so relieved, and she was so happy that I finally became a teacher, even though I told her I made way more money with design. 10 years after that, I really wanted to go back to grad school, and I signed up for a post-academic studies at the Rietveld in Amsterdam. and it dealt with Second World War memorials, which the Netherlands is covered with, but also to create new ones that would address all the current wars in the world. From that moment on, my work took a huge shift. When you work with a subject matter that is so huge as war is, I just decided that from that moment on, if I even achieved it before, that my work needed to be like a very meaningful one-on-one conversation between me and one audience member. It's been 14 years now since I left Amsterdam for Los Angeles to join UCLA. I take my teaching job extremely serious. The money I make with that job allows me to live a very comfortable life. So years ago, I decided to not make money with design anymore, to exchange my clients for collaborators, and to initiate my own projects with no deadlines, but also no money. It has been the best decision I have ever made. I have now full editorial freedom, and I can fully research the future of print in a digital era. Like radio, that became way better and more specific when television was introduced, we need to look at print as in relation to websites and other digital information carriers. I think the book needs to be more tactile. I think using specific inks, specific varnishes, specific paper to create visual effects that you would only experience if you have the book in your hand. The other thing that I find really important, since the source material is getting really scarce, I think designers cannot let a tree die twice. Instead, they need to turn it into a paper product that people want to keep and cherish. My book projects can now take longer than 2 to 4 years from first idea to research to putting together an editorial team and inviting writers, but then also find money, find a distributor, and find a publisher. Even though I have taught classes on activism, with, for instance, Hurricane Katrina as a subject matter, or World AIDS Day, or the homeless issue, I found it harder and harder to put subject matters on my students, because I think they need to find subject matters that they want to do something for themselves. After the presidential election, I felt super depressed, probably like many. And to this day, the only answer I have to the current situation is to fight it with love, to put a huge effort into making that love visible in my work. My love for an artist and their work, my love and commitment for this new educational method on acting I helped to develop, the attention I have put into the typography, the consideration for color and page and book form. And all I hope is that whoever flips through my books recognizes these gestures of dedication. That is what I do this work for. This is what I live for. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Our next presentation, Kathy Opie.
All right, I'm all mic'd up. I'm going to kind of walk around here a little bit. It's weird not to be at a podium. So I'm going to start with telling more about my story, about how I came to not only be a photographer, but my relationship to academia and why art is also work. So this is actually the very first photograph that inspired me to be a photographer. And this is a photograph made by Lewis Hine, and it's of a child in a South Carolina mill. And when I was in elementary school, I wrote a book report about this. And then I came home and I asked my parents for a camera because I wanted to be a social documentary photographer. And so I did that at 9, and it was because of this photograph. Because of a girl working at a way too small of an age to be working. And this is also one of the reasons why I wanted to be a social documentary photographer, was because Lewis Hine was the first photographer who literally was able to change child labor laws in the United States through the documentation and the images that he made. So we go from this South Carolina girl to the girl in Ohio. So this is the first self-portrait. I'm 9 years old, definitely a baby butch. Zipper half down, haircut really messed up because I probably wouldn't sit still for my mom, with my little house in Sandusky, Ohio, behind me. I was taught to work from a really early age. At this point in time, I was probably in the winters, chopping kindling and selling it door to door to my neighbors. Like, there was never not work involved in our family. Our family owned a small company in Ohio called Opie Craft. We made basswood boxes and plaques for people to decoupage, and we also owned a little bit of praying crayon. And so it was my grandfather's company that my father came home to run, and I was born in Sandusky by the same doctor and even had the same bus driver as my father growing up. And so this is the first self-portrait. And the work has always vacillated in relationship to me exploring and discovering what is around me and what is significant. So at 9 years old, I'm literally taking photographs of fire hydrants, Barbie dolls, friends like on their really cool Schwinn Stingray bikes and so forth. And then with it happened to be a self-portrait as well. So I to give you a little bit of background, I moved from Ohio when I was 13 years old to Poway, California, which is North County, San Diego. So I left like Lake Erie and growing up on Lake Erie to the middle of what I considered moving into the middle of a John Wayne movie. I mean, it was just chaparral around me. And so I began to explore that as well and began to think about what that community was at that time period. And I continued to do photography all the way through high school, even though my photography teacher told me that I should quit and I wasn't any good at all. And he would rip my pictures up in front of the class, which was horribly damaging, but it didn't get me down. And so I moved from, after I graduated from high school, I took 2 years off as a gap year. I had been a really kind of major camp counselor, like really believed in being a camp counselor, and had done 5 years at the YMCA and at Camp Marston. And then I decided to be a 6th grade outdoor education teacher, teaching forestry and riparian up in the mountains for Orange County. And so I went off and I did that. And then I knew that I kind of wanted to be a photographer, and my parents were like, no, you need to get your real estate license. It's really not going to work out for you to be this artist. And I'm like, but I really want to be an artist. Aunt Sue and Uncle John are artists. And they're like, yeah, but it didn't really work out for them. Now did it? And so I was like really compelled to be like, okay, well, so I'll get my real estate license, and then can I go off and be an artist? And they're like, okay, go ahead. So I get my real estate license. I'm this junior realtor. My dad owns a real estate company. I'm farming for him, doing all of that, like putting together and stapling all his real estate things, handing out calendars at the end of the year. And meanwhile, I'm photographing while I'm doing this. So one of the important things about work is that any job that you have actually leads to ideas in relationship to your own work as an artist. And I was like, when I figured that out, I was like, oh, great. So if I carry a camera everywhere with me, then I'm doing work, and I'm going to be okay. So I went off to college, and I went to San Francisco Art Institute. So I moved up to San Francisco, And I worked from 3 to 8 in the morning as a front desk clerk in a residence club. So I'd get up 3 to 8 in the morning. I'd do the wake-up calls. It was an old switchboard system, actually. And I'd be like, "Good morning, Mr. Vanderbilt. This is your wake-up call." And that was like how I started my day before getting on a cable car and going over to the Art Institute. And then I traveled down after graduating. I took a gap year in between that and grad school. And I actually worked at Rainbow Grocery in the Bay Area, where I figured out how to make the perfect symmetrical 400-pound carrot wheel. And I felt like that was really valuable work. Like, I can make a really great carrot wheel. I can make produce look like you just don't even want to buy produce because the display is so pretty. And so that was like good work. So I end up in Valencia, California, where CalArts is. So I end up going and getting my graduate degree at CalArts. And I don't have a car because I was living in San Francisco. So I get plopped down in the middle of basically what looked like Poway, California, where I grew up. So I plopped down right in the middle of a master planned community after I had just like been this totally out dyke in San Francisco, and then all of a sudden I'm back in suburbia. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't have a car. What's going to be my graduate work? And my graduate work was defining the master plan community in relationship to how it's sold to us, and really expanding those ideas and the ability to do work in a completely different way than I had been making artwork in San Francisco. So I had all these amazing queer professors at CalArts when I was there, and they kept saying to me, "Kathy, like, why aren't you making queer work?" And I'd be like, what does that mean? You know, like, what does that mean that I have to make work in relationship to my identity? Because actually critiquing master plan communities is really thinking about the relationship of the other to what is being built out here within the suburbs. And so that work began to be like kind of crazy. And I spent 2 years making over 200 photographs and making that body of work. This is part of an installation that was shown later on at the Orange County Museum of Art. The floor that you see has actually just been reinstalled by another artist, Rodrigo Valenzuela, who's in our department now. He ended up curating from the collection and putting in the installation. But this is also about work. So when these communities are built, everything gets swept away, the green grass gets rolled out. There's no sign of the worker anymore. There's no sign of the idea of what the artifact is, and that's something like I've always been interested in terms of photography. So this is all what's left behind, a floor that you walk over in the museum of the debris that's left behind on the construction site. So it begins to represent the worker that's forgotten in relationship to what white flight is as far as a master plan community and who works in these communities by building these houses. So going from that, I ended up, I'm not going to show you all the work because there's a lot of work. I started making portraits, and I stopped going outside, and I stopped being a street photographer, and I decided that it was actually really important to begin to make work of my friends in my community. So this is an amazing performer by the name of Justin Bond, who goes by Vivian now. And Kiki and Herb is one of the great kind of queer, old school queer performance work that you could imagine seeing. And I would go back and forth from San Francisco to LA, and I would have 1 month off in August, and I would load my car up and I'd go to San Francisco. I'd get a room in a friend's house because I couldn't afford to pay another rent. At this point in time, I'm working at UC Irvine, designing and building the photo facilities at UC Irvine. So I'm a lab, basically a lab manager. And so I would only have like 3 weeks off that I could pull out to begin to do this. So I would load up my station wagon with all my camera equipment and all my seamless and head up. And people would give me a studio to work in, and people would allow me to sleep in their homes. And I would do dishes and things like that. And so one of the other things is like, any way that you can make your work, you kind of figure out how to do it because it's what you're absolutely passionate about. So I continued to make these portraits. This is Mike and Sky. And it was about a 5-year period of time. And at that time, I was, really exploring my community. This is Crystal Mason, and what it meant to really make images of a community that's often just fractured in relationship to body parts. So it's about piercings or the cuttings or things like this in terms of the body, but what it meant to make incredibly humble portraits of a community that was utterly fragile in relationship to the AIDS epidemic. Sorry, I all of a sudden got a stutter. At this point in time, I'm also part of ACT UP and Queer Nation, and realizing that I couldn't just make art about other communities, that I had to make art about my own community, that was utterly important. This is Pigpen. Pigpen is in a new body of work that maybe some of you saw at the gallery called The Modernist, which is a piece I had just finished this past year. And one of the nice things is, my friends are really willing to always sit for me. This is Chloe, Frankie. And at the time that I made this work, and being a lab tech, I thought, I'm screwed. I'm never going to be able to get a teaching job being this out. There is absolutely no way that I'm going to be able to do what my passion is, which was to teach. And so especially making images like Dyke, where in 1993, my friend Stake tattooed Dyke on the back of her neck, self-portrait cutting on my back. So what happened from that was I ended up being put in a lot of exhibitions. Exhibitions that I wasn't really quite pleased about, but some exhibitions that I was really quite pleased about. Like in Europe, they said, oh, we want you to be in this show. Is it a boy or is it a girl? And I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to really actually participate in that kind of title of a show because that's not the point of the work. And so going from self-portrait cutting on my back, which was very much about a longing of domesticity for myself, I then had my son Oliver in 2002, and this is titled Self-Portrait Nursing. So within the work, it always revolves around the idea of community, my relationship to community, what it is to image a community, and the larger world around us. This is, I started making portraits now on black for the past 5 years. This is Oliver and his mouse, Mrs. Nibbles. And then they're all primarily of artists. And so instead of using my friends, I started using my friends who were artists who also, there was a fragility in many people that I was asking to sit for me because they were getting older and they had been in my life forever, and what it means to bear witness. And bearing witness as far as a part of work in relationship to photography is an incredibly important term for me. So this is the artist Lawrence Weiner. We have Glenn Ligon, Cecily Brown, and David Hockney. So David turned 80 this year, and David has never not been kind of in my atmosphere. I mean, I met him when I was 24 years old. A lot of friends worked at his studio. And so when you take portraits, it's a very different type of work than when I'm taking landscapes. I vacillate between landscape, portraiture, and kind of urban photographs. And all of them have a kind of a different position and a different idea for work for me. The portraits for me are really about the relationship that you share within a moment within the studio. It's a very short period of time, but it's a very much of a shared moment. And what that is to share that kind of moment and have somebody sit for you is a really incredible thing. This is a little clip that I'm going to talk while it plays in the background. This is going back to Ohio, and this is Lake Erie where I grew up. And I made a very large piece for the Cleveland Clinic in the Hillcrest Hospital, where I did a whole corridor of every season on Lake Erie using the kind of middle horizon line that I've used throughout other bodies of work that I'll show you after this clip. And it was really interesting to make a piece that's permanent for a hospital because often artists are used to having very transitional work. Like we put work up in exhibitions, they come down. We don't get to live with the work. We make the work and we're living with it when we're making it, but we don't really get to live with our work in relationship to how we install our work. It kind of all just kind of either goes into collections or goes off to other places. So to be able to kind of stand on this lake that I grew up on and begin to slowly make these images that are about the 4 seasons of Ohio that live in this hospital was really incredible, because it gave something back to a community. Because often when tragedy strikes and a hospital's involved, and I've had letters from people in Ohio, it's really amazing to think that art can also begin to heal people in hard times, that maybe a chapel isn't going to work at this moment, but a hallway of lake images begin to do something else for you to transport. And these bodies of work are really important for me because they're a moment of meditation for me as well. The portraits are really intense because you're communicating and you're working with people to communicate. But when you're all of a sudden out on a landscape by yourself with an 8x10 camera, which the ice houses were photographed with, there's a moment where I no longer worked in the dark room, but because of technology changing. But what happened was the kind of bearing witness at landscapes that slowly changed, and watching the light became almost my darkroom practice, where it was very meditative for me. So I think it's really important to understand that when you're making work, that you go into all these different kind of personas or places in relationship to what you're trying to make and convey. I've always said that the reason why I make photographs is not only to kind of add to history and that relationship of what I had with that early photograph of Lewis Hine, but that it is also about creating a history and answering one's own questions. So in the same way that this is a series of questions that we're asking, often a body of work will start with a question and what I need to do for that question. So these become, the horizon becomes obliterated. They have a big conversation with Ryman as an abstract painter. When they're vertical, are they still landscapes? Because we always think of landscape as a horizontal form. Do we end up being able to kind of go through them? And then what happens when they're all hung up is they become a fractured landscape, a fractured panorama. And what is it in relationship to global warming and the time we're living in terms of a fractured landscape? And how do we begin to think about work beyond what visually is presented before us, but also what it can do metaphorically in relationship to the way that we look at work? Surfers followed ice houses, and they're just surfers in the PCH just hovering and sitting. And it's also they're meditating to a certain extent as well, because they're waiting between the surfing. As I'm watching them, they're watching for the next set of waves. And all of this is kind of a really important way for us to be able to be transported. And I feel that images do not only teach us things, but they also transport us to these different places that we might need to go as human beings. Humanity is fragile, as we know. And within that fragility, I have also been making political landscapes where I go to protests and groups throughout America. And I've really done a lot of bodies of work in relationship to America and Americans' identity. What you're not seeing is high school football players, a lot of different work. But this is an immigration march. And one of the things that's, not only are they fighting for immigration and their relationship to labor and work, but then also how does the American flag begin to represent different moments of protest, so that this is a war march. So that these landscapes are literally as important and as filled as maybe the empty landscapes in the horizon. And there was an incredible show that Helen Molesworth did at the ICA called Empty and Full, where she finally put the seascapes with these political works. This is a Tea Party rally. And so this is also a Tea Party rally. So in a way, work for me, my own artwork informs my teaching, And I've also been teaching for the last 28 years. But at the same time, it's very separate from my work too. So there is this way that I use personas and I have multiple hats on, that when I'm in the classroom, I'm not there to think about my own issues within art. I'm there to think about my students' issues with art. And I think those are all really important. This is from I photographed the inauguration and made a book of it, the 2008 inauguration of Obama. And so these are all kind of political portraits to a certain extent. Prop 8, when they took away our right to marry. 100th anniversary of the Boy Scouts of America, their jamboree. And then I leave on this image, which is the Women's March in downtown LA. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathy. Everyone, Abel Valenzuela.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I want to also thank the planners or the organizers of this event. This is a lot of fun. I also want to give a shout out to my students who are here from Intro to Labor Studies and everybody else. Fully realize that this is Tuesday before Thanksgiving week, and so I think tomorrow is going to be even more empty. So I'm very, very lucky. When I think about work, I'm actually working. So that really puts me in a privileged position, and I truly love my job and what I do, similar to the previous speakers. I've spent about 3 decades studying work and workers. And so when I was asked to speak, I took my assignment very seriously, like everybody else, and I thought of 3 things that I can share with you when I think about work. And so the first will be a little bit more personal. The second will be a little bit more academic-y research, what compels me and motivates me to come to work, to study work. And then the third is what worries me in the sense of how work is changing and what we, and when I say we, I'm mostly talking about researchers, academics, students who are interested in this topic, what we might do to make it better, but in particular to make a couple of really important key connections. So let me start with the first. So when I think about work, I think about hands, and I think about arms, and I think about bodies, like Kathy. And I also think about physical exertion, hard labor. Here I want to draw on the personal connect to my father and to my mother. My father will often poke fun at me because he'll touch my hands when we're sitting down. He'll hold them, right? And he'll comment that they're soft, or that, he'll ask me what other fancy cream I've purchased, and I tell him, Kiehl's, do Kiehl's, right? But he'll comment on the softness of my skin. He'll also make reference to the relatively small size. And the reason why he'll make this reference is because I spent a lot of time trying to understand day laborers, which in Spanish are called jornaleros, right? Jornada. It's more in reference to really your arm and to the actual act of working. And when you study day labor, you learn a lot of things, including the fact that many of these workers work with their arms. And so the image of hard work translated or became really important for me, thinking about my father and actually going with him to his workplace. Very early in his settlement here in Los Angeles from Mexico. He was about 16, and he found himself in Boyle Heights. And a friend of his from church, he was going to a Seventh-day Adventist church in Boyle Heights. A friend of his invited him to learn how to upholster, how to basically make old furniture new. It's a trade, it's a craft. And for some reason, that's what my father very much stumbled into, but he was really, really good at it. And I remember spending a Sunday, for example, and he would literally, there'd be a couch, a love seat, right? And then the larger couch. He would have me help him, and we would rip it up to its basic frames, right? And then he would magically spend the next 3 or so hours making it brand new with brand new padding and, of course, the new material that the client had picked. And I was stunned because he did this all with his hands, from replacing a broken piece in the frame to cutting up the material. He would sit down and he would sew the material into its connections, and then he would assemble it all together. And so early on, that's what really impacted me, is my father's use of his hand and working very hard. You'll notice I said that I would spend weekends visiting or hanging out with my father, and that's because he worked very hard. It's one of the areas of research, I'm not sure if Dean Osborne will talk, but when you think of entrepreneurs, one of the things that comes out is the hard work, the dedication, the commitment, and there's a strand of research that looks at family and their involvement in entrepreneurial work. And so some of you in the audience who are entrepreneurs will know what I'm talking about. My father, he opened this business as an upholsterer, and he was really good at what he did, and he had a lot of success. And that meant that I didn't see him a whole lot because he was always gone, always working. My mother was similarly always working, mostly in the house, though she put herself through community college, Cal State Los Angeles, and then became a teacher and joined a union. And similarly, worked hard. So early in my career among my siblings, or early in my life, excuse me, among my siblings, work was fundamental. It was really important. When I think about work, and here I'll move to my second arc of thinking, I think a lot about equity, social justice, and making a living that allows workers to house, to clothe, and to feed a family. I worry a lot about workers in our country who work full-time, year-round, and they still find themselves homeless or living on a check by check. And all I have to say about this is you can do the numbers yourself. Look at the federal minimum wage, multiply it by the number of hours in a day, number of days in a week, number of weeks in a year, and add it up. And then you can look at the federal poverty threshold guidelines, and then you can place yourself, and you can even place yourself and your children if you have children in your household, and you can see where you stand in this threshold. And for me, what I find so stunning is that here you have workers who are working full-time, year-round. They take their job extremely serious, and yet they find themselves nowhere near being able to achieve the American dream, much less what we're taught early on about the Protestant work ethic and what it means to work hard, and how that then leads to other opportunities. And sure, there's part of that trajectory, and I don't want to deny that. Hard work leads upwards into bigger and better jobs, but increasingly data shows that some of those pathways are more difficult than they might have been in years past. And so I spend a lot of time trying to understand different pathways, including entrepreneurial pathways, mostly with workers who folks might not think of in an entrepreneurial context, like day laborers, who will oftentimes hand out a business card or have sophisticated networks that lead to different job opportunities, or who will work with other workers in a collective to offer their employment. And so a lot of my time is spent interviewing, collecting data, working with graduate students and with other professors, trying to understand our labor market, both the demand side, the types of jobs that are created, and the supply side, the types of workers that exist and what we can do to help them help themselves in better jobs. The third area that I want to share with you is what I think about, at least in the future, with regards to a couple of research projects that I've been thinking about. And it has to mostly do with work and wellness. And here I'm not talking about occupational hazards. That's an area of research that's pretty well established that links, I think, labor studies with public health. I'm referring to other sorts of stressors related to working so much, so long in such a driven sort of economy, where making ends meet are increasingly difficult, where finding jobs are increasingly difficult for many, for example, of our own college students who come from institutions like ours, right? That is adding a new layer of anxiety and stress, and we know very little about how to make our workspaces, such as our spaces here at UCLA or in other places, that can help us make work and wellness a whole lot better. And so those are the things that I think about when I think about work. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Al Osborne, Jr.
Thank you, Ryan. That's a very comfortable couch, I want you to know. Well, I'm what stands between you and a robust conversation. And so I am going to do two things. First of all, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I think about when I think about work and jobs. And because I've decided not to talk about myself, but instead talk about what some of my colleagues in the Anderson School think. So we have prepared a video that would be shown after I make my very measured remarks. I thought that I'd make it a bit more of a community. You see, I'm experimenting with video as part of my work in my current role, deciding that people don't read emails the way they did. I spent a lot of work trying to write a good email from time to time, and you know what that's like, because if you don't do it well, it will come back to bite you sometimes. But then again, people aren't reading them the way they used to. So how are we going to communicate? In my role, that's a lot of hard work, being able to develop the right way to communicate with the various audiences, students, alumni, the people you're asking for financial support, yourselves and others. So that's kind of what I thought about at first, but I said, I don't want to go down that path. So I said that when I think about work and the future of work, I really decided to think about the role that human beings have in work and how they define themselves with their job and how that's actually changing for a lot of people. And more importantly, the bottom line of what I'm going to be saying is that if you don't have some other kinds of skills that come from being able to innovate, think entrepreneurial, think critically, develop certain leaderships and organizational skills, you will not have a job. The world is dramatically changing. I'll talk about some of those changes in a minute. But if you aren't, the future of work, in my judgment then, means a lot of us have to be able to find another way to make a living, because we're going to be automated out of most of what we do. Who's going to get automated? A recent McKinsey study that I had a chance to look at in preparation for this event, half the activities that we do at work today, however you define your job, are going to be done by machines or some sort of artificial intelligence that doesn't need you, impersonal. Not a world I particularly like to live in. But 15% of the global workforce, about half a 500 million people or so, will be displaced by 2030. Now, you have to put a lot of faith in McKinsey, and a lot of people who make these kinds of forecasts are often wrong. But the good thing about these forecasts is that they get you thinking about, well, what does it mean if then, by 2030, 500 million people don't have a job, or don't have a meaningful way in which they connect with what they need to do to survive at something more than the poverty line, or at a level of, understanding with what life is all about. Why do we live? Why do we work? Do we live to work, work to live? What is all of this stuff that we do for? Anyhow, that's a more involved question. But these are sobering statistics, to be sure. Now, as a business school dean and as a professor of entrepreneurship, I've understood a little bit on the latter side about hard work. And the truth of it is, those of you who are actually trying to have a life that's meaningful, where your job and your work connect to your total being and your presence and who you are, that gets closer to what I think a job should be all about. It shouldn't be drudgery. You should be something you enjoy, that you're passionate about, that you feel. And so the kind of examples that lived here are people who've made those choices. A lot of folks don't have that freedom, though. They really have to, because why don't they have that freedom? Because they were never able to have the opportunities to develop choices and learn how to be critical in their thinking as they moved forward in their lives. They kind of never went to school in a way that you have. So many of you, our students here, are privileged, actually, to be able to have the luxury to avoid the prospects of what a truck driver is going to feel like in about 20 years. No job. Or maybe find yourself in support activities that are growing slowly, as opposed to, say, directive activities which require this thinking that are growing rapidly. What choices are you going to make to live a life that you enjoy? And it is in your control far more than it is in the control of many of the people I just talked about. So when I think about the future of work and the role of people in it, I think about leadership. I think about how we organize to produce value. I'm labored by the fact I'm an economist by training. And my view is that if you're not valuable to society, you certainly will not have a job, because nobody will be willing to what? Pay you for whatever it is you think you might be offering. You've got to come to terms with that. So the only way you can avoid that is be an entrepreneur, where in fact you do what you want to do, and you find a niche where in fact people really value what it is that you're doing, and you therefore then have the ability to innovate and lead and organize into the future in such a way where you satisfy a value-creating proposition, but at the same time have a lot of fun doing it. Part of what we're trying to do at Anderson, therefore, is to help our students understand those ideas, to be able to think, let's say, outside the box, be able to adapt, be flexible, to move quickly, to accept challenges and to never give up learning. Look at every opportunity as setback as a way to get into something new. Know that there are no boundaries except the ones we put on ourselves, and know that if you get up every morning and work hard, you will probably win, because a lot of people haven't figured it out. And out of the kind of inertia that they find themselves in, can't get ahead because they don't know how to. And the key thing then is, how do you know how to get ahead? And in our world of big data and data-driven, it's critical thinking and analytical skills that are at the core of your ability to move forward. And that is hard work. And I happen to believe then that you can handle those drivers of the world of work that is changing, technology development, globalization, if you're better educated and you take your ability to think critically about whatever it is you're doing and analyze it and ask questions and extract value so that you will be worth something to others if you want to make a living. Now, that's a harsh way to look at things. But in the Anderson School, we are trying to teach our students how to prepare for that kind of world. And we have a lot of projects that they can do, and I just want to talk about one. We can teach you about how to recognize opportunity. That is where you can do something that somebody else wants that might pay you for it. That's kind of a good thing to do. We also teach you how to harness the resources to exploit that opportunity in a positive sense. And if you worry about the environment and other things, that can all be accommodated in your view of what life is all about. But you've got to be able to do these things, in my judgment, if you're going to do more than just survive. And we have something called the business creation option, not Osborne, although we could probably think about that too. The business creative option. So what's that? Okay, kid, so you say you want to start a business? You've got a business plan? Do it. Let's see you do it. Not everybody shows up because it's hard work. It's satisfying and funny, but it's not the same as you make it happen is not the same as thinking about it. Can you do it? That's hard work. And more of our success as we get automated and as the world changes, if we aren't prepared to learn, we're not going to be able to do it. And do it means that we have to be able to organize and lead and get groups together and actually produce value. And the business creation option is one of those ways in which you learn whether or not you have those soft skills to make it happen. And so I'm going to stop right here and say that it's important that we try to live in the world we're in and make it better. And in doing so, maybe get paid for it. But if not, be satisfied that we're making progress so that all of us can cooperate on this little planet that is really just a small part of whatever the broader civilization that exists in space is all about, and try to be happy. I'd rather be happy doing what I like to do, being able to afford it, than the alternative. And so I'm going to turn the video on and leave the podium here and sit down in the most comfortable couch I've been in a long time and watch the movie. Thank you. Okay.
There was a poll, and the question was, will your job exist in 10 years? And 70% of the Americans said no. If you believe your job will not exist, you're really frightened of your future.
We are wondering what is happening to the world. Everything is changing.
The very idea of human being some sort of natural concept is really going to change.
We're now in the early stages of the fourth industrial revolution, which is bringing together digital, physical, and biological systems.
We need a different economic model. And by that, I don't mean capitalism versus communism. What I'm talking about is a shift in the system that will allow us to meet the basic needs of every human on the planet.
The prediction of 5 million jobs lost by 2020 to technology is serious, but it's not the main question. The main question is, what will be the future of work? How will we define work? How will we share the wealth?
Even though we have everyday problems we have to solve, we have to find a way to lay the foundations for the innovations of tomorrow.
We are in the midst of massive transformation from a worker perspective.
The future is already happening at places like Amazon that hires a bunch of Anderson and other top MBA graduates. They are tasked partially with designing themselves out of a job, designing automated tools that allow customers and Amazon suppliers to get help without any human intervention at all.
So we've tried in the Workforce of the Future study to position 4 alternative options of what work might look like. In the blue world, corporate is king.
There's a huge divide between the winners and losers. It's big capitalism on steroids.
The red world is all about speed and innovation.
Already innovation is the big driver of economic growth, and innovation happens by definition when you have new ideas, and new ideas happen, they spring from diverse sources.
The prime focus in a green world is all about society and corporate responsibility.
And HR as a function is going to have to find ways to design jobs that are intrinsically motivating and shape cultures that are intrinsically inspiring.
Technology in the yellow world really enables people with ideas or aspirations, or somebody that wants to start their own business. It enables them to come in to that world at a much lower barrier to entry.
More and more now, there's a data revolution that's happening. With the amount of data that is being created through e-commerce, through smartphones, through connected devices, etc., there's a wealth of information now that can create new products and services and unique applications.
The demand for data science is universal. We're seeing companies of all sizes and types looking for people who can make better decisions with data. They're looking for someone who simultaneously can answer the business case, but can also bring the technical, the R, the SQL, the Python. To me, that's the future of work.
As a nation, we are not creating a workforce that's suited to the reality of the 21st century. We're still stuck in the 20th century. So here at the UCLA Anderson, we're moving more and more in a direction of experiential learning, in which the faculty member is the coach, encouraging, supporting. You got to really believe in the human capacity.
You can't sit back and wait for the future of work to happen. You have to plan for it today.
That's great. Thank you. As we do every week, let's take 2 minutes, everybody, like I'm doing, stand up, shake out, maybe lean over to someone you're sitting next to, try a question on, get an answer, and we're going to come back and with microphones carry a conversation forward. Thank you. Okay, everybody, let's be rehearsing a couple of questions. I'm going to start the conversation really up at the sofas here.
Well, you can
Abel, if you can join us. We're going to, in our comfortable sofas, if we can. Thank you so much for those 4 presentations. I thought I'd first open the floor to the 4 of you. Maybe if there's things that resonate between what you were saying and some of the things you heard in the other presentations, or ideas that are a spark from the things you've seen.
There were very interesting overlapping moments, I thought. And it almost causes me to, oh, I wish I could have said this and that and that, because I want to maybe add, after hearing you speak, that yes, I feel extremely privileged of where I am right now. And you know, as a graphic designer, the only job you actually can really take on, and maybe that goes for artists as well, is that teaching job that is not completely separated, but separated enough. So in the Netherlands, you don't get paid that much for teaching. That is something that you need to do after you've established yourself at some point. And so you give back to community. So my trick was always to make more money with design, because that felt better. I was a designer first. It's kind of interesting that my job at UCLA now provides for how I want to run my practice. And I'm truly grateful for that. That is a wonderful gift.
You know, your comment about design, I have come to believe that design will survive and be a successful occupation into the future, by the way. And by the way, in STEM, if you spell STEM, STEAM, that's the A in it, I think artists will survive. The problem is getting to an economic model that works. The reason I'm resonating with the comment of design, because I've come to appreciate how a great designer or a graphic artist can find what's there that I couldn't find thinking linearly in my PowerPoints. But a designer takes it and thinks, and all of a sudden it explodes into an act of beauty, and it's valuable. And let me just put it that way. And so I want to work with the design element as we build people who can critically think and be entrepreneurial. And good entrepreneurial firms putting together businesses, how do you get that pop out of your ideas unless you design it and you develop those skills? Same thing with photography. I mean, you know, you have to see something in it, I find, that can create that extra thing that you, and I'm going to get right down to it, that you're willing to pay for. So my plain PowerPoint sucks. That's a technical term I sometimes use. But if I pair it with a designer or some other element that gives it a life, or I use photography to express my words, and I think visually. You see, as an economist, to be able to think that way is a real plus to my ability to have a competitive advantage in what I'm trying to do. So thank you guys for doing what you do.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you.
I mean, it's interesting because I think that a lot of times people really consider making artwork like art, you know, it's like I remember I was on a panel at one point and a critic turned to me and said like, well, why is it artwork? Why isn't it art play? Like, don't you guys just get to play every day in the thing that you really love? And it's like, no, it's actually work because you take a long time trying to hone your craft.
Yeah,
and
there's skills.
There's a lot of skills involved in it, and there's a lot of relationship to how you do outreach in terms of ideas and community and kind of putting forth your ideas through a visual way. But it's interesting, I think, often, like, you know, I imagine parents are really excited that their kids are going to Anderson, where we get like, oh, really, you're going to get the art degree, huh? You know, so it's an interesting thing because art has become like big business as well. And I think that that's often something that isn't talked about really in academia. It's something that I talk to my students about. But
you know, I'm going to make a crass commercial for art and architecture and say that there is a minor in entrepreneurship in the college now. And your students can be part of it.
Oh.
And so if you love history, for example, but you don't think you can get a job, if you take a minor in entrepreneurship, your parents will love you because then they will think you're going to be an entrepreneur. But what you're really doing is satisfying your love for history or art. And at the same time, you're learning these other skills that give you an edge over somebody else who is not being viewed as valuable as you will be because of these other skills. And so I encourage you to build skills. Just don't be one-dimensional. You can have a passion for your art, or you can be interested in, say, Egyptology. But boy, if you know something about entrepreneurship, what you do in art or Egyptology can take on a whole different dimension and give you an edge. I don't know, just a thought. Entrepreneurship,
you know, I would just like to point out that a lot of the conversation, I think, is at a different level when we talk about work. And so I want to bring us back to the millions of folks who work and don't think about how I think about coming to work on a daily basis, right? Arriving to this campus, or after this event, right? Going to my car and driving away and marveling at the beauty of our campus, right? That's, I think, a very privileged reality. And so I want to bring us back to how we might think of entrepreneurship, for example, for a different set of workers. And by here, I'm not thinking about conventional sorts of ways, because I think you have to think in unconventional ways when you think about different types of workers, right? And so for me, the big challenge is how we get workers who, for example, go to street corners on a daily basis and look for work, or women who enter people's homes, right, to clean them and are basically working alone. And so it complicates how they might communicate with other women who also clean homes, which we know in Los Angeles number in the hundreds of thousands, right? And so how do we think about channeling their very hard work ethic, social networks, because many of these women have multiple clients. They certainly know how to clean because there's a huge demand for them. But how do we make their lives better? Because a simple way of thinking of that is by making their lives better, they also make our lives better. And by extension, the rest of Los Angeles and California, because they're able to spend time with their children if they're earning a good income. They're able to invest in their children's education and health and other areas that allow their children to engage with us. So these are some of the issues that I'm trying to push us to also think about.
Right.
Thank you. In different ways, what your presentations touched on, I found in very individual forms, is the idea of a kind of community around that figure we might think of as the worker, or the groups of people that we work in relation to. This idea of community and of a kind of connectedness that sometimes work offers. I think the phrase you might have used, Abel, was pathways to work. And I'm curious, maybe at a personal level, for each of you if you might want to speak a little bit to the kinds of communities you think of your own work in relation to, i.e. perhaps it might be peers within your respective fields. It might actually be, in a very literal sense, those communities where you locate your practices in different ways, but that they are kinds of communities.
So you want me to start with that?
You can go for it.
Looking at me?
No, you just happen to be sitting right next to me.
I mean, it's interesting because I don't know. I think obviously I consider audience or viewership in relationship to my work, but I don't think that I'm trying to serve the audience as much as I'm trying to serve myself as an artist in relationship to work. And one of the things that I wanted to, kind of bring up is like the idea of ethics too. And I think that one of the, in relationship to how we hire or how we work or even how we run a studio, what is our own kind of personal relationship to the ethics of work in allowing people to actually move forward? I know that I am one of the very few artists in LA who gives full health care as well as pay into a pension for my studio assistant. And I really fight for other artists to ask for that. But there is always within work or even in relationship to exhibiting and who hangs the work and all of that, there's an enormous amount of ethics in terms of the haves and the have-nots and the place of privilege that I definitely operate out of as somebody who can not only make a living teaching, but also make a living through selling my work. And I think it is that individual responsibility and clarity that we need to have as far as our own consideration to humanity that actually has to drive not only the work, but also our own ethics within work.
Sure, some of us will So there are some apps, for example, that will identify restaurants that take the high road. And by that I mean they will pay their workers a living wage, they will offer sick leaves and benefits and vacations. And the whole idea is that as consumers, we can exert a whole lot of influence on companies. And in this example, restaurant workers, in your example, the art that we shop and buy. And it doesn't require a whole lot of research, right? There might even be ways to advertise clients, or proprietors rather, that take the high road. That's where I like to put my money. I'm sure many people have choices, right? And where we invest, I spend a lot more time thinking about where I give, what I buy, and I do put my money in certain political and other areas. I think there's a lot of power in that, and I think we don't do enough of that sort of high road collective support of each other. But that's a really good example of how we can do this together.
Thank you. Shall I open the floor? Should we take some
Yeah.
questions from
Yeah.
the audience? A small test for this week in the questions you're about to pose. Imagine asking a question that could be addressed to a couple of our guests at the same time. I think part of what we're going to try and tease out is some of the different connections, coincidences, random affiliations that might come up, but I'm hoping our questions might help with that. Hands still up? Do we still have hands? I see one right there in the middle of the room with a microphone.
Hi. Thank you for the wonderful talks. I'm just curious what your opinions on unpaid internships are.
That's getting real here.
I don't believe in them. I think everybody should be paid.
You should refuse that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of valuable things that you can have out of internships. You know, it's often a privilege to be able to work alongside of someone, you know, especially if it's somebody that you respect and so forth. But the problem is you're still being taken advantage of, in my opinion. And so everybody should have a fair and beyond fair wage, in my mind.
Sure. You know, one of the things that I do in addition to running the Institute is I actually serve as special advisor to the Chancellor on immigration policy. And one of the issues that we're actually having a discussion about is internships and what they actually mean for students and also the economic context. And I think it's a complicated question. And I don't want to brush it aside and like, oh, we need to study this. But let me just give one simple example. I was in a meeting where there was a group of students who were really concerned about the rescinding or the termination of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which basically allows undocumented students to work. And so the concern was less about the income coming in as a result of being able to work, because young people without documents who don't have DACA have been working since forever. It's a different, I mean, this is our country. Undocumented immigrants work, including young folks. And so the income wasn't the issue. The issue was the actual experience. They're wanting to gain valuable experience that would allow them to secure employment in the future, right? And so some of them were willing to do internships, if you will, without pay. Now, I'm one that believes that we should pay for internships. In principle, I really do that, and I don't offer unpaid internships, even though I get students volunteering for that. I do think that there are instances where an internship that's not paid could be extremely valuable for you, and so I probably would not discourage you from pursuing that, in part for the context that I gave related to immigrants and wanting to build that human capacity so that you can be much more successful post-UCLA.
I'm going to say that I'm okay with unpaid internships because I've had them, and I know that if I can get into a situation and prove myself to somebody, they're going to pay me a lot because they'll realize that I'm valuable. It's all a question about your job strategy. If there are a lot of people that are looking for the same job and the employer is not paying, let's forget about whether it's right or wrong for the time being. The reality is that you want to get a job, and there are 87 people applying for the same job, and the employer can choose. In our economy, it may not seem fair, but there are people lining up to do work to prove themselves. So you just got to be careful. So my philosophy, take it, work in the mailroom, and if you do it right, you'll become the president of the company.
Or organize with a bunch of unpaid interns to collectively get
That sounds way more fun. Thank you.
Exactly.
Right up here up front. Yes. Let's get a microphone to you. Sorry, is there one nearby? Here, thank you. I'll bring it around. Let me just grab. Thank you.
Thank you. You did a great job at arranging this because I would think of it this way, but Kathy and Henry, you were simply terrific case studies.
Thank you.
And coming up before both of you, in particular, what have you done that's exceptional? You've continued to grow and redefine your job throughout your whole career. You're doing something very different now than you were 10 years ago. Speaking to Al's point about life growing. And so one of the issues is a lot of people just mail it in corporate America. And you should be thinking, you should also be thinking about growth and personal growth, and how can I work myself out of my job? Because if I go to evolve to a much higher skill level, that you've done throughout your whole career, that's what your mission is about. You'll get paid a lot more, and society will be a lot more productive. So we need to think about a society as personal growth. The final comment I would have is, I work with kids in East LA. If you just give them a bit of knowledge, it's amazing. They do not know how to spell entitlement. The kids in Brentwood know how to spell entitlement. So I work with a young woman who was just coming back to the system. She said, I want to be in a bank. I said, why? You're very good with numbers? No. That was her only frame of reference for clean, silk, toilet plates. And I said, well, you could work at Northrop Grumman. Whole world opened up. And so she was really willing to work. And if you look at people in those circumstances, you want to be dead, maimed, or in prison, or do you want to be earning $75,000 or $100,000 bucks? And if you sprinkle a little water on those people, they will grow.
Thank you. Just a moment. Let's go back up. Do we have microphones in the audience? Right over here. Thank you.
Hi. Just going off of that, I think we live in a world where people are working harder than ever before for less money than ever before, and those who are at the top are working fewer hours for a far greater reward than ever before. As somebody put it to me, it's never been easier to be a billionaire, but never harder to be a millionaire. And I found that the video ironically admitted that Amazon is hiring UCLA grads to design the automation that is putting them out of jobs. They have other practices coming to light attempting to stop unionization and other issues like that that we don't need to get into, but I think as college students, a lot of the internship work that we've been doing is the very data input that is allowing corporate America to stay on top. And Janet O'Shea last week asked a question that I kind of want to redirect, which is why our business is too big to fail, but our communities and our cities are not. Following that up, how do we stop the same corporate companies that are profiting from all of this from actually profiting off of the social responsibility? Because that has now also become really big business, and how do we fight this growing attachment of business to nationalism?
Those are really good questions.
Whoa. Thank you. Who wants to step up and take a version of that?
I think you organize and you fight back. We number much more than the companies, right? But it requires some sustained effort, right? There are models that work of stopping, for example, Walmart from locating in certain parts of Los Angeles, right? There are other models that help us explain why we were able to pass minimum wage to $15 an hour in the city of Los Angeles, right? It's going to be phased in. We'd like to get it through California. But fundamentally, I think, comes down to organizing. Now, what do I mean by organizing? I'm not talking about organizing workers in a traditional factory firm sort of union model, though that clearly exists and it should continue to exist. But I'm talking about working with clergy. I'm talking about working with a robust civil society that includes community-based organizations. I'm talking about working with clergy. I'm talking about working with women's organizations, many who have started to spring up as a result of the current administration. And I'm talking about working with students and with researchers as we leverage knowledge at a public institution like UCLA to resolve and solve community problems. So I think efforts at organizing are much more complicated than what I suggested in terms of the union organizing, but much more complicated. There are examples. I don't believe California is a bubble. I think we've been working for a long time to make this a much better state. We have a lot more work to do, but it's these sorts of efforts that I think allow us to have agency and push back.
I have the microphone right here. I have a question. My question is, in what ways are the conditions of labor different for women workers than for men workers? And especially for Kathy, in a world that, for the photography world and art world more generally, in a world that is so male dominant and requires you to exert your body and yourself so much into public space and professional space, which seems to be like super male dominated in your case.
Yeah, it is very male dominated. I mean, they're very, I can name a huge host of men who, who have much more distinguished careers as me, but we're the same age and we've been making work at the same amount of time. I think it's an incredibly difficult thing, and I think that I've just always pushed forward with not being afraid of my own voice, because my voice, it was just too important for me to make the work that I wanted to make. And I think that, that it's a very different time than my mother's. It's now going to be a very different time as my son looks at me as his mother for other women in his life in relationship to his friends group. I think that it does change, but the amount and the increment that it changes is utterly unfair, and it's hard not to get disillusioned. But in going back to the other question is, I just believe in small acts of kindness as well in relationship to it. That if you talk to another person, you get them involved, and that by creating community and putting community around you and also imaging that is a very powerful way to have your voice. And I've been fortunate in that way as a woman artist to actually have a voice and have major survey exhibitions at, incredible museums. And it's very hard for me with my other female friends that are older than I or the same age. There's definitely jealousy that happens with me in relationship to my own career with friendship. And that's an interesting thing to try to navigate, because it's not like anything that I'm doing to them. It's about what they didn't get that they wanted. And I think that you just have to acknowledge all of it. You always acknowledge everything that's in the room, and you talk about it.
And the question extends to the other three speakers as well.
Wow. What was exactly the question again?
The question was, in what ways are the conditions of labor different for women workers than for men workers?
Yes. Weirdly enough, it took quite a while in graphic design for women to be as famous as their male counterparts. If you look at typographers, people who design letters, that was a job primarily done by men, weirdly enough. And I could name Susanna Lico, who did that wonderfully in the 1970s. But it still is something, it's hard to find female typographers. Having said that, it's not about only male and female. every time I'm asked to name a non-white graphic designer, I need to go to my list and, okay, I come up with 10 names now, which don't ask me now because they're not in my head. But there's the diversity that you would expect in a career is just not there, and there's reasons for it. As I mentioned, my dad, not being in the Netherlands, going there, had a list of professions that he thought were honorable. Graphic designer or artist was certainly not on that list. In the Netherlands, you saw that with the Moroccan immigrants and the Suriname immigrants. Those parents would not send their kids to art school because they thought they would not earn a penny in life, as my mom thought. I wouldn't. And so that's, to me, probably why those things go so extremely slow.
So I think we're, I'm sorry, were you finished?
No, I was done.
I think there's very little differences other than I think we're more attuned to the differences, in part because of a contemporary period, different sorts of social movements. I think we have a lot more to do because there still remain huge race and gender disparities at the workplace. And there are literally a host of public policies that we can pass that can make more equal the playing field. One simple example that some of us might be familiar with is that we are no longer allowed to ask for one's salary when you go through the interview process, right? It's now illegal to ask for one's previous salary. Lots of research shows that that was used to the detriment, to the disadvantage of mostly women applicants, to some lesser extent, but also people of color, right? And so while meeting legislators after many years of debate and discussion about labor market impacts, passed legislation, now it's illegal to do that. And so the idea is that that will move to make things more equal between male and female applicants for jobs. Lots of other examples of different policies. It's just, we need the will. Elections matter. We need folks to pass these acts, these laws. And then, of course, we need enforcement. Slightly different story. But we know and have solutions to resolve many of these issues. We just don't have that political will. It's complicated. It's more than will. It's organizing. It's strategizing. Elections matter. It's changing people's minds, showing how research makes a difference in these findings.
Thank you.
These questions are not easily answered in sound bites. And the question of, as I see it in the business school, is creating access for everybody and trying to have a society in the places and communities in which we work that somehow will accept people for what they are and what they can contribute, and basically create a world of cognitive, what I'm going to call diversity. That's the best way, where you judge people the way you want to be judged, and it's a way, and you get away from our own stereotypes of, well, those are women and those are men and those are green and those are black, and we got to get behind all of that and just judge people for who they present themselves from some higher level kinds of things. Are they real? Are they authentic? Are they honest? Can I trust them? Are they the people I want to be around? Would they want to be part of my community? Oh, I got to change these people. I mean, that's the way I look at it.
Thank you. Thank you. And we have time for one more question. And I'm sorry, over here, I want to come over to this side of the room. We haven't done it yet. I see a microphone right there. Yep.
I don't know if this is, okay, great.
Is it on? Yep.
Yeah. I want to say thank you to everyone for preparing these presentations. They're also wonderful. Thank you for the time. And on the topic of work, what are your thoughts on illegal occupations such as narcotic smuggling or prostitution. I'm interested in understanding how it affects the world around your work, and to what extent do you think that these types of positions or jobs are necessary to both the individual themselves and to your work?
Jesus.
And for all of you, or any of you that can answer that, please.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll take a quick stab. I study men who look for work on street corners, and so I've been asked to make links with women who similarly look for work on street corners. I don't have major issues with what some folks call the oldest occupation in our history. I do, however, favor efforts to collectively organize sex workers. There are examples globally that shows empowerment and other values associated with collectively coming together. I also know that there's another part of the debate related to exploitation in the sex trade industry, and that's a different part of this story, i.e., in other words, processes that empower, that bring folks to collectively organize. We can draw on literature to help us think more thoughtfully about that trade. Not sure I can comment too much about the drug market. I don't think you were referring to cannabis, though I do believe in regulation of that. Okay, yeah, thanks.
I can only say that I grew up and come from the Netherlands, so
they're organized in the Netherlands
prostitution,
too.
Who cares? Drugs, it's fine. And there's, of course, a nuance. But I will tell you that the prostitutes in the Netherlands have a union, and so they're taken seriously in the worker community in that sense. And again, there's probably a lot of stuff that's not pretty in that world. It's, I don't know, but I didn't know how I feel about. If you ask me, am I pro-drug smuggle? Probably not. I mean, people get
I don't think that
killed
was the direct question.
that way.
Al?
I'll take a stab at this. Again, I didn't grow up in this country. I grew up in Panama, where there's a much more tolerant attitude for a variety of things. I don't think drug smugglers should be unionized or deserve any. I believe transparency is important in our society to move forward. I'm for legalizing narcotics of all kinds. I'd rather having them taxed and over the counter, and hopefully educate people so they know what's good or bad for themselves. A little bit like prohibition in that regard. There are lots of places, and I do not believe that we should make Colombian warlords rich. And so you got to take the profits out of the distribution. The reason it works, and the reason we have gangs, is there's a lot of money in it because people have to pay huge prices that they otherwise would not have to pay if the drugs were legalized. So transparency and legalizing and allowing you to choose your favorite medicine, but then maybe educating you that it's killing you, might do something to decrease the demand for these activities, and then they'll go away. But as long as we have the morality of it driving common sense, you're going to get a lot of illegal behavior, which is profitable for some group to take advantage of.
Thank you, Al, and thank you so much. Our work is coming to an end this evening. As we always like to do every week, we've got 1 minute, and I'm going to turn it over to the four of you. Any final comments or thoughts for the evening? In a sentence or two.
My work is only beginning. These are incredible questions that you asked, and I did not feel I did them justice. So keep thinking the way you're thinking, and you'll be able to see some real positive light at the end of this tunnel of inquiry.
Thank you. Thank you. Kathy, Henry, Abel?
Organizing can work, sorry. And, you know, it brought us the weekend, it brought us 8-hour days, and linking students to that activity while at UCLA and after UCLA, I think can make a huge difference and impact lots of people's lives.
Terrific. Thank you. Henry?
I learned a lot tonight. I thought it was interesting to hear these four talks and to see overlapping issues. There's a lot of difficult questions that are almost too big for me to answer or to even... And it makes me realize that I grew up with such different values and norms in the Netherlands, and we're one of the Northern European countries that wanted free healthcare and free education, and there's this simple tax idea that if you earn more money, you're going to pay more tax so that you support people who have less money. That all made real sense to me. And ever since I'm here, I'm so puzzled about everything. It's like, wait, what? This is crazy. So
we're all just disappointing the Dutch at the end of the day. You know,
I know.
Kathy?
Oh my. It's been a long day. It's the end of work day. I had 6-hour back-to-back critiques today before coming to here. So my brain is a little fuzzy at this point, but I think that the most important thing in terms of the takeaway and what everybody was actually really saying tonight is a little bit what I touched upon, is that there is the work that allows you to obviously sustain your living and your life. But then what is that within that work that you can find your own relationship and ability to also find the same kind of joys in making a 400-pound symmetrical carrot wheel in a grocery store. And I just think that, you know, it is important from an individual level to understand that, you know, it really is about building community and about the relationship of growing that, and that one person talking to another person actually can make a difference. And I think that that's how I kind of want to leave it tonight on those words.
Terrific. Thank you so much. All four of you, thank you. Join me in thanking our guests this evening. Thank you all. And thank you all for coming in on a shortened work week. Enjoy the long weekend for those of you that have it. We will see you next Tuesday when we ask the question, what is knowledge? What is knowledge? Next Tuesday night. Thank you.